So hello, my name is Jennifer Cinco, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on behalf of the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. Today's webinar will be recorded, and there will be time at the end for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A box to submit questions during the presentation. Why won't you go? Here we go. So our panelists, you can see them on screen now, but they will be turning off their cameras. So just to prove that we're all real people. But before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable. The Roundtable is a coalition of organizations working at the intersection of immunization and cancer prevention. Hager and Vaccinate Your Family are two such organizations, and I am so pleased that they are here to share their expertise with us today. Our mission is simply stated, but complex to achieve. Ultimately, we are working towards the radical reduction and even elimination of HPV-related diseases. It feels audacious to say that we could eliminate cervical cancer as a public health problem, but we have the tools with HPV vaccination and cervical cancer screening to do just that. As the Director of Communications and Public Engagement for the HPV Vaccination Roundtable, I spend a significant portion of my day trying to answer two questions. The first is, how can I help make it as easy as possible for healthcare providers to recommend HPV vaccination? And second, how can I help make it as easy as possible for people to accept that recommendation? You might think that during this era of unprecedented access to information, especially online information, that it would be easy to use social media to answer these two questions, not just for HPV vaccine, but for all vaccines. However, we are all here today because we know that online misinformation about vaccines is a serious public health problem. Not only can exposure to online misinformation negatively affect a person's intent to vaccinate, but misinformation can spread faster than factually correct information and can result in long-term attitudinal shifts that pro-vaccination messaging may find hard to overcome. While the news today is focused on COVID-19 vaccination misinformation and the impact it will have on vaccine acceptance, this is not a new issue. COVID-19 vaccines are not the only or the first vaccines to fall victim to online misinformation. HPV vaccine, measles, flu, you name it. Unfortunately, those of us in the immunization space have been working to combat vaccine misinformation online for longer than we would have liked. But fortunately, we have learned successful ways to combat this problem, and we are happy to share with you what works. So before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to get a quick pulse check on how confident people are feeling about their ability to take action to identify misinformation online. So you should see the poll, and hopefully, oh, a lot of, this is fun. So I'll end it here in a few more seconds. Get your vote in. All right. All right. So it looks like roughly half of you, or exactly half of you, are somewhat confident. And a significant proportion of you are very confident. I really appreciate the 7% who say that they are not confident, because our goal today is to really empower you to feel like you know the actions you can take to combat misinformation. Let's see, I do have a second poll, which I can't seem to launch, so we'll move on. So for now, I'd like to introduce Catherine Nickel, our partner at Hager. She is the Senior Vice President and is a wonderful dear friend of mine. So Catherine, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Catherine Nickel with Hager, a Washington, D.C. based communications firm. We work primarily with organizations who are committed to improving health, advancing education, and transforming communities. And I want to thank the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable and Vaccinate Your Family for making this important forum possible. So let's get started. To set the stage for today's forum, we must acknowledge that at this moment in time, trust in our public health agencies is at an all-time low. One of the reasons for this is the rampant spread of misinformation on social media. As more and more people have access to social media platforms, and in many cases are actively seeking out health information online, health-related topics continue to be the target of misinformation. This includes efforts that attempt to mainstream or normalize scientifically flawed or flat out inaccurate research or related information about vaccines, including the HPV vaccine and the COVID-19 vaccine. As health communicators, individuals, and organizations, we are faced with the challenge of stemming this tide of misinformation and, to the best of our ability, correcting misinformed beliefs. So why is this so important? The challenge in front of us is in many ways cyclical. The misinformation feeds the lack of trust. The lack of trust feeds acceptance of misinformation, and so on. Just a few months ago, in December of 2020, nearly a year into this historic pandemic, the AMA documented concerns that a significant portion of the population might in fact reject vaccines because of distrust and misinformation. The AMA also expressed concerns about lack of trust in government and public health officials and the urgent need to restore that trust. In January of this year, there was significant news coverage of the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is an annual trust and credibility survey, and it concluded that an epidemic of misinformation was eroding trust in both institutions and the media. Backing up that sentiment, the World Health Organization warned of an infodemic of false information about COVID-19, or what they refer to as a misinfodemic, defined as deliberate attempts to disseminate wrong information to undermine the public health response and advance alternative agendas of groups or individuals. Now, it's important to note that while these targeted misinformation efforts occur every day, misinformation is not always rooted in conspiracy. Many times, the person perpetuating the misinformation, particularly on social media platforms, is doing so out of genuine concern for themselves, their families, and their friends. But regardless of the source or the intent, misinformation results in confusion and mistrust. So what are we called to do about it? The AMA is one of many public health organizations calling for all media, including and especially social media, to consistently convey factual information from credible sources while challenging and rejecting misinformation. In today's world, that is a very tall order. So how do we do it? Today, our partners at Vaccinate Your Family will show us how to identify misinformation in social media, how to call out false information online, and how to stop the spread and end the perpetuation of online misinformation. As we prepare to hear from Vaccinate Your Family, let's remain hopeful, inspired, and optimistic that together we can stem the tide of vaccination misinformation and hesitancy, rebuild trust in our public health agencies, and ultimately save lives. Thank you for your time today and for your commitment to this work. And now it's my pleasure to turn things back over to Jen Senko.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for neatly making the case for action. Now we will hear from Vaccinate Your Family. Vaccinate Your Family has been fighting vaccine misinformation longer than any of us would have liked. I am so pleased that Jennifer Zavolinsky and Robin Coral are here today to share not only how to recognize vaccine misinformation, but what to do about it. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us today on this public forum. I'm Jennifer Zavolinsky, as Jennifer from the HPV Roundtable just said, and I am the Director of Public Health Education and Communication. And during our time today, I'm going to give you a little background on Vaccinate Your Family for those who are not familiar with us, and talk about some of our efforts to combat misinformation. I'll help you figure out how to identify some vaccine misinformation posts and videos online, depending on what kind of messaging is being used and who is the source of the message. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at Vaccinate Your Family, Robin, who's going to give you some ideas on how to respond to misinformation when you see it pop up on your feed or when you're browsing online. And she will suggest a list of some credible organizations like Vaccinate Your Family, Hager, the HPV Roundtable, where you can go to get the facts about vaccines and vaccine preventable diseases. Next slide, please. So Vaccinate Your Family is a national nonprofit organization. The organization was actually first called Every Child by Two, and our name was Every Child by Two until late 2018, when we decided to change the name to more accurately describe who we are, and the fact that we promote vaccines for people of all ages. Vaccinate Your Family was more appropriate. The organization was started by the former First Lady, Rosalind Carter, and the former First Lady of Arkansas, Betty Bumpers, in 1991. And they started the organization in response to a measles outbreak in the US. Unfortunately, we're still having outbreaks as early as 2019, 2020 for measles. And of course, we have now COVID. And I think organizations like ours and other nonprofits that promote vaccines are going to be needed forever. There's always going to be questions, and so there's always going to be groups like ours that need to help get out the information to people. And just so you know, our mission is to protect people of all ages from vaccine preventable diseases by raising awareness about the need for immunizations, increasing the public's understanding of the benefits and safety of vaccines, ensuring that all families have access to the vaccines, and then advocating for policies that support timely vaccinations. Next slide, please. So in addition to sharing science-based information about vaccines and fighting vaccine misinformation online on both our social media pages, our website, we also have a Shot of Prevention blog. We also have been working with the media for a number of years to help them get the facts about vaccines and share the facts about vaccines and make sure that they don't fall prey to the concept that they always have to have two sides of a story when it comes to the science of vaccines. We know that in the past, there's been a lot of reporters, and things have definitely gotten better on a national level. Let me just say that. But there's been a lot of reporters that used to put a mom who said that she was harmed by her child was harmed by vaccines, and putting it up against someone who has been a vaccine scientist and vaccine researcher for 20 years, and saying that their opinions are completely equal, and there's no, there is no fact. So that is something that we've worked on with the media for quite some time. And the national media, as I said, is definitely getting better. Local media, some places are good and some places still need a little bit work. So we keep working with them. And we also work with different partners across the country and present at conferences and on virtual meetings, webinars like this one. Next slide. So I just wanted to give you a little background of Vaccinate Your Family's start on social media. We actually had one of the first pro-vaccine pages on Facebook. It was launched in August 2008, and the page was actually called Vaccinate Your Baby, because that was the name of a public education campaign that we were doing with actress and mom Amanda Peet. And we were trying to address misinformation and help educate people about the benefits and safety of vaccines at that time as well. And our page was a gathering place for a lot of vaccine advocates. And I think as a result of our page, a lot of vaccine advocates started their Facebook pages. So there's definitely more pro-vaccine pages out there now than ever before. And our page actually remains one of the largest pro-vaccine pages, only focused on vaccines. So not compared to someone like American Academy of Pediatrics or Family Physicians or anything like that, but one of the largest pro-vaccine only pages. And altogether on our social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we've had about 3.8 million total impressions and 176,000 engagements in 2020. And you can see on this slide, it lists where you can find us on each of the social media platforms. And it also just shows 2 examples of the graphics that we used on social media recently. Next slide, please. So in 2019, the World Health Organization said that vaccine hesitancy is one of the top 10 threats to global health. And a lot of people think that COVID-19 was the thing that actually brought a lot of opposition to vaccines into the limelight. But actually, opposition to vaccines and vaccine misinformation has been around a long time. Actually, as long as vaccines have been around. So people have been opposing vaccines since the first smallpox vaccine from Dr. Edward Jenner in 1796. And this picture on the slide shows that people were saying that they were going to get cow heads erupting from their bodies after getting the smallpox vaccine. And I know it's hard to see in this cartoon, but that was the rumor going around. And I would say the only thing that changes is the reason for people opposing vaccine and questioning vaccines. It's always like a whack-a-mole. First, it's the mercury in vaccines. Then it's vaccines are causing autism, or aluminum in vaccines is dangerous, or vaccines take away people's health freedom. I mean, it's constantly moving, and researchers have been doing their best, and people in public health are doing their best to catch up. It's really not difficult. I mean, I would say it's difficult when you're trying to actually give the science and the facts on your side and trying to make sure the messages are accurate. When you don't have anyone to actually let them know that you're actually like giving the truth. I mean, people can write anything, as you know, on social media, and no one's actually questioning them many times. And that's what we're trying to change now. Next slide, please. So even though most people use the term misinformation when they talk about false vaccine information and vaccine myths online, there's actually 2 categories of false information. One is misinformation and one is disinformation. And the difference between them really is intent. So for misinformation, it's accidental. It's wrong or misleading information with the power to dilute, distract, or distort facts. And with disinformation, which is basically a lot of what we see online and on social media, it's deliberate or engineered falsehoods, and it's circulated with bad intent for the purpose of serving a personal, a political, or economic agenda, or many other reasons, to be honest. So for the purpose of this presentation, even though a lot of it's going to be disinformation, talking about disinformation, we're going to call it misinformation, just to level set. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to tell you about a few tactics that are used to spread misinformation and how you might be able to identify it. So one of the most popular ways to spread misinformation is using a simple narrative and then using really vivid imagery to elicit some kind of strong emotion like fear, anger, or disgust. And if you look here, there's this picture of this baby doll and showing that it has obviously needles sticking out all over the place from all the vaccines that they need by age 2. And I would say that a lot of people would see this and just be disgusted or frightened by it, or want to ask their friends, like, do you know anything about this? And so when they see a message like this, I think it's really easy to just, forward it on. Just also to make sure that it's not true the way that it's being represented here in this photo. Next slide, please. Another way that people use messages to spread misinformation is using anecdotes or personal stories. So this example that I have here is of a woman named Desiree Jennings, who, I don't know if anyone remembers her, but she received a routine flu shot in, I believe it was 2009. And she did a video on YouTube saying she was experiencing fever and painful body aches. And then the symptoms were quickly progressing, and she could only walk with a twisted, halting gait. And then she started walking backwards, and she became a crazy media sensation. There was stuff all over the regular news, all over social media. And she also was a former cheerleader. So seeing her flopping around and stuttering one moment and then talking with accents the next moment, I mean, it was crazy, and it went completely viral. And as you can see, a lot of the natural groups that took over her story, basically saying that she was cured naturally by someone who practices alternative medicine. And this was later found out to be a complete hoax, and that she completely faked everything. But I will say that you could still find her videos online, and so people still share them. And that's one thing about misinformation. It's like impossible to get rid of it, especially with social media, because even if you debunk the information or the myth, it's always out there, and people are always coming across it, finding it, and sharing it with others. Next slide. So this next tactic is implying that doctors, public health, and scientists can't be trusted because they are paid by the pharmaceutical company or big pharma. And people just need to follow the money to find out, if your doctor is actually being persuaded by pharma, and that you can't actually trust anyone because they're being paid and they're not going to tell you the facts. And so I just have two different graphics here from social media that I thought I could help identify this particular tactic. One is showing Dr. Pan, who is the vaccine advocate in California, also a legislator, who is constantly attacked on social media. And this implies that he is being bought off by big pharma, and that he's basically a Nazi getting money and giving vaccines. And then, of course, we have this other graphic saying never trust the advice of actions of people who want to show you they only want to destroy you, and saying that all the risk is from the people getting the vaccines, and that we're only saying trust us, but you can't trust anybody. So that's one to definitely keep an eye out for. Next slide. This next tactic is talking about mostly vaccine requirements and recommendations, and the fact that when we ask children to be vaccinated in order to attend school, we are taking away people's rights. The anti-vaccine community has really, particularly since I'd say 2015, when there were measles outbreaks in California, and public health was trying to stop the outbreaks. I think that the anti-vaccine groups were connecting with other groups that have other worldviews, like related to politics or health freedom or gun control, etc., and using the idea of us versus them. And so you can see there is one graphic showing that legislators are trying to take away rights, and they say your personal protection, and they're making you get vaccines, but they're going to take away your guns. And then this other one shows a graphic that is the Health and Freedom Conference, Freedom Conference 2021, that's going to be taking place soon in Oklahoma. Next slide. Another tactic is saying that correlation means causation. So the idea that someone got vaccinated and then because of the timing, and if they got sick or something bad happened to them right afterwards, it had to have been the fault of the vaccine. So this one graphic that I'm showing on the slide talks about a woman who got COVID vaccine, and then supposedly she was found dead the next day, and they're saying it had to have been the vaccine that caused it. Also, I just wanted to tell you about a doctor that we work with, that his wife is also a doctor, and he tells the story of how she had a child patient come in and they ended up having a seizure right before they got their routine vaccination. And if that would have happened a few minutes after getting vaccinated, the parent would have been positive that the vaccine caused the seizure. In this case, they were lucky, and the seizure, which did not harm the child long-term at all, was caused by fever, and it happened no matter what, if they would have gotten vaccinated or not. So that's just an example of the timing issue. Next slide. This, I just wanted to show you, this is talking about messages using unconfirmed stories and claiming they're fact. It's a video that was created by Voices for Vaccines, which is one of our partners. And I think it's really good. There's no sound on it, but it's just a very short video showing on social media how messages use really simple messages, and no name shared, no details ever come out of this later on, but how it's very tricky and how it could be very convincing. So Jennifer, if you can hit the play button, that'd be great. Oh, I think you did. Sorry. Great. So as you can see, Voices for Vaccines is actually a great place, particularly their YouTube channel and their Facebook page, where you can see videos like this, where they show you very specific examples of how misinformation is being used to spread falsehoods about vaccines. So on this next slide, I talk about when you're trying to determine if a message on social media is misinformation or not, definitely check the source. See if they're trying to sell you something. Are they trying to sell you vitamins? Are they trying to sell you something natural, like a natural treatment to help your disease? Are they trying to gain some kind of power or influence? not all, but some vitamin companies and other natural groups like this Energetic Health Institute are definitely groups that make money off of saying that vaccines are not safe and that you should go the natural way. And while the vaccine community doesn't have anything against natural remedies, we still have to remember that they are not tested, and vaccines are extremely tested overall. They take many, many years to create. This before COVID, let me just say that. And so, vitamins don't have to get any kind of FDA approval or anything before they say, this vitamin helps with this, or this natural treatment helps with that. Whereas vaccines are really monitored for their safety and effectiveness and need to go through the FDA to get approved, and are continuously monitored even after FDA approval. So definitely be a little suspicious if you first see that they're trying to sell something in your message. And then also, I would say, see what kind of doctor, if they're saying they're a doctor, see if they're licensed or what kind of doctor they are. Not every doctor or researcher, even if they have a PhD, MD, or DO after their name, is an expert on vaccines. They could be an expert in something else like cancer, but not everyone is an expert on vaccines. And there are some groups such as chiropractors. There are, for some reason, a lot of chiropractors that are pushing the idea that you can have everything solved, all diseases solved, if you just get realigned. So while I think chiropractors have a great thing to offer to the world, just know that they are not necessarily the expert in vaccines, and that not everything can be solved by getting your back cracked. And then also the last part I wanted to mention about the source is just note that not all opinions are equal. It's not that everyone's opinion is equal. Like the mom's intuition is not necessarily equal to what a scientist is saying. Not saying that mom's intuition isn't good and mom's intuition doesn't work ever, but just sometimes that you can't equate the two, and that you should definitely listen to the science. And yeah, so that's all I wanted to say on that one. Next slide, please. This is just a slide that talks about how to identify good science versus bad science, and how to find out if you're looking at credible or valid study data. So in good science, a researcher uses a formal scientific method to conduct their study. And in bad studies, researchers often start with their theories, such as they believe that the mercury in the flu vaccine, which is not in all flu vaccines anymore, just very few and very small amount, causes children to have autism. So they would start with that theory, and then they would design their study to try to prove that conclusion. And so definitely look for that. One of the things about a good study is that a researcher should be giving you all the information needed to judge the value of their study, and not only the information that they get out of their study that leads for you to agree with their study results. Good studies are usually published in well-respected top-tier journals. Sometimes bad studies are self-published. And then a lot of times messages related to science is people like cherry picking what studies they want to focus on. So they'll talk about studies on vaccines, and they'll only mention the ones that say that vaccines cause harm, and they don't mention any of the thousands and thousands of studies out there that show that vaccines are safe and effective. Next slide. This, I just wanted to highlight some known sources of vaccine information, just to give you a heads up. There are people still on Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, YouTube that are out there and looking to spread dangerous misinformation about vaccines and proper healthcare, no matter what it costs. Don't get fooled by names. RFK Jr. Has an organization called Children's Health Defense. It sounds great, but they are definitely looking to spread misinformation about vaccines, as well as the National Vaccine Information Center, the Energetic Health Institute, leaders like Del Bigtree and his Vaxxed movie, and some others. So just a heads up with these people. Next, please. And so there are known people who target vulnerable people and minority populations online. So there are some anti-vaccine activists and some unethical healthcare providers that have been targeting parents of autistic children for a long time, offering natural or other dangerous treatments like chelation to cure autism. And that is super dangerous. There's also people who are targeting people who lost their children, particularly when they die unexpectedly from SIDS. And one example of that is this Katie Klobes, who lost her daughter Evie to SIDS, and now she is convinced that vaccines were to blame versus SIDS. And then there's other groups like RFK Jr. who've been targeting minority populations, particularly African Americans, for many years because of past atrocities that have happened, like Tuskegee. And while these people already have problems trusting the government and medical system, people like RFK Jr. are taking advantage of that and trying to turn them into anti-vaccine champions and spokespeople. Next slide. So I just wanted to thank everyone for listening to me, and I am sorry if I ran a little over on my section, but Robin, take it away.
Thanks, Jennifer. So let's talk about social media. Let's talk about what we can do. So as Jennifer mentioned, misinformation isn't new, but social media has certainly made combating it more interesting and a little bit more challenging. Many of the social media platforms use algorithms to determine what you see in your newsfeed and in what order. Many of you are probably already very familiar with this, but the more you engage with sources of misinformation, the more likely you are to see more of that content, more of that misinforming content, and that can cause a feedback loop. At the same time, the more you interact with science-based content, accurate content, the more likely it will be seen. So this is really important to know, because research shows that the more people see something, the more likely they are to believe that it's true. So when we talk about combating misinformation on social media, we're not just talking about correcting false claims, but also dialing down the visibility of misinforming content and amplifying accurate and science-based messages. And for their part, social media platforms like Facebook have tried to take steps to limit the spread or impact of misinformation, typically by putting a warning label on content that might be false. And you can also report things that you think might be misleading or inaccurate, but those warning labels alone aren't enough to combat misinformation. The way we make a dent is really by more of us stepping up and speaking out. So let's get to the meat of it. What can we do? Unfortunately, it depends. I know that's a thing that people hate hearing, but it's true. It really does depend. There's no one size fits all approach to combating misinformation. What you can do will depend a lot on the context of the situation and your own comfort level. And so how you approach a friend sharing misinformation in their Instagram stories, for example, will be different than what you might do in the comment section of a local newspaper's Facebook post. And if you only have 1 minute or 2 minutes, you might respond in a different way than if you had more free time. But the important thing to remember is that there's always something we can do when it comes to misinformation, and that we should not let misinformation go unchallenged. Because when we do that, the more likely it is to be believed and potentially hurt people, which is really what this is all about. So next slide, please. So today I want to talk about 3 simple steps that you can take as an individual to combat misinformation. Push back on misinformation when you see it, be proactive about sharing science-based content, and sharing personal experiences. And I'll talk about each one in turn. Next slide. So let's start with pushing back on misinformation when you see it. one of the easiest ways you can do this is by reporting inaccurate claims to the social media platform. And nearly all of the platforms have a way to report misinformation. Most of the time, you just need to look for those three little dots, those ellipses that usually indicate more settings or options. And so I'll go over just briefly how you can report on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And then don't worry if I'm going too fast, I will let you know where the instructions are for reporting for all of the social media platforms if you want to see how to report on TikTok or wherever. So next slide, please. So this is an example of how to report on Facebook. You just find those three dots at the top corner of the post. These screenshots here, they are from the desktop version, but the options are the same on the mobile app too. You just might need to tap the picture or the video to make the three dots appear. And then it's really easy. You just in a few clicks, you can do this in literally just 15, 20 seconds. Click the three dots, find support or report post, select false information, and now Facebook does give you the option to say that it's health related. And with just those 4 clicks, you can go ahead, report it. It'll get flagged in Facebook's system. And if enough people do that, it will hopefully start a reaction that will get Facebook to start taking down this content. Next slide, please. Twitter won't let you flag a tweet right now. As of today, it won't let you flag a tweet as medical or health related misinformation, but you can still report posts that you think are misleading or misinforming, again, by looking for those 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner and then selecting report tweet, then click it's suspicious or spam, and then it's something else. Unfortunately, we still can't flag medical misinformation on Twitter, but a lot of people on MedTwitter have been beating that drum and hopefully putting pressure on Twitter to make that change happen. But until that does, you can just select that it's suspicious and let them know that it's something else. Next slide. So on Instagram is owned by Facebook, so the process does look very similar. You click those 3 dots and then select report. You can mark that it's inappropriate because it's false information, and then again, you can flag it as health related. Instagram, I will say, is a dumpster fire for misinformation. If you're not active on Instagram, but you're interested in this area, Instagram could use a lot of help. It's really hard for algorithms to automatically weed out images with words on them. So it's a place where reporting is really desperately needed. Next slide, please. So on YouTube works a little bit differently. The 3 dots are there on the mobile app. You can find them in the top right-hand corner. Again, you might just have to tap the video. On the desktop version, it's actually below the video on the bottom right. And when you click to report, you can select that it's spam or misleading, select that it's a scam or fraud. And then YouTube does ask that you type in additional details about what is wrong or what is misleading about that particular content. But you can report on this platform. And I strongly encourage you all to do that when you see them, because YouTube, again, is a huge source of misinformation. Next slide. So I know I went through that quickly, but don't worry. So the WHO does have links to instructions on how you can report all this or on all of these different platforms. I know TikTok is a huge thing right now, and I didn't cover that. But I'm also going to throw up in the chat, there are, in addition to the WHO website, which I just put in the chat, you can also go to stronger.org. Stronger.org is a campaign that was set up specifically to combat misinformation about science. And they have instructions on their website about how to report on each of the different platforms. All right, next slide, please. So in addition to reporting, you can push back on misinformation when you see it by responding. So research shows that when you challenge somebody directly, they might actually dig in their heels and believe even more strongly in their views. We know that from past research. But observational correction, or seeing someone else get corrected, can help steer other people away from believing the inaccurate claims. So even if you don't have hopes of changing the poster's mind, the person who's posting, you might not change their mind. Those lurkers, the people just scrolling by, might actually pause and think about the claim if there's a little comment underneath that says, hey, this is misleading, if people post a fact check underneath it. And so even if you only really have time to say, hey, this isn't true, here's a link, it can signal to those people scrolling by that they want to think about it before they just believe it. Research has shown that one of the reasons why people believe misinformation is because they just don't think about it that hard. When given an opportunity, when we're scrolling, we're thinking about when we're scrolling our newsfeed, we're kind of moving quickly, right? You see a headline, you move on. You see a post, you move on. And as you're moving on, your brain is kind of taking that shortcut of like drawing a conclusion. And so you might just have a gut reaction to believe what you're seeing, and then you just kind of move on. But it's stored away in the back of your brain. But research shows that if you give people a chance to actually think about it, or you prompt them to think about things more critically, then they're less likely to believe that misinformation. So even though a really quick, hey, this is misleading, here's an article explaining more, might not convince the person who posted, again, that's not who that's for. That would be for the people who are scrolling by, who you're trying to prompt to think about things before they just believe them at face value. Next slide, please. So when you're responding, there are some things you should keep in mind. As I mentioned, consider the onlookers. If people are just scrolling by, what kind of impression are you giving with your comments? For example, using bullying or overly aggressive language in your response can make the original poster more sympathetic to onlookers, and people might want to side with them or their content and dismiss what you wrote because they're really put off by your tone. So you want to be thoughtful about how your comment might be perceived by people just casually reading the conversation. Even if they aren't directly engaging with the conversation, they might still be reading it. Along those lines, empathy can be really important in changing hearts and minds. So not everyone is an expert in vaccines or immunology, and it's perfectly reasonable to have questions, especially if something's new or you just don't really fully understand it. Raising a concern or asking a question in good faith does not automatically mean that a person is an anti-vaccine activist or like trying to sow misinformation. They might just be sharing the misinformation because they saw it and it concerned them. It elicited a very strong emotional reaction, and they're just looking for reassurance or clarification. And we don't always know that intent when we see those posts. So, it can be helpful to start from a place of empathy, assume benevolence, and give other people the benefit of the doubt when you're responding. Just be kind. If you can, respond by starting a new comment thread. This goes back to the algorithm discussion. The more you engage with something on social, the more likely it is to get prioritized by algorithms. So if you reply to a misinforming comment and then get into a back and forth with people in that thread, people will probably see the original comment, that one that contained misinformation, but not necessarily everything else that you put in your replies. So starting a new thread, and then if you need to go have a back and forth on there, will allow you to make sure that your informing, your accurate comment is more likely to be seen. We also want to recognize that people respond differently to different kinds of messages. So some people really like data and charts, and others might be more receptive to personal stories or experiences. This is what happened to me. So try to use a mix if you can when you're responding. And then lastly, know when to take a step away or move the conversation to someplace more private, like text message or video chat. This is especially important if you have a relationship with the person who's posting the misinformation. And some people might be really embarrassed or have hurt feelings or get uncomfortable if you tell them what they posted wasn't true or that it was harmful. So in some instances, it really might be kinder or better received if you move the conversation to a less public space. Next slide. And one of the tools that you can do that is called the case method. I won't get into detail about it right here because we're talking about social media specifically, and this is really more of a tool that can be used on one-on-one discussions. But it was developed by Allison Singer at the Autism Science Foundation. And it's just a simple framework, it's a simple formula that you can use to guide a conversation when you come across somebody who has questions or who believes that something isn't true. I would caution that this formula might not translate well to a comment section full of strangers. So be mindful when you use it. But if you are a science-minded person like me, having a framework, like step 1, step 2, can be really helpful when you're talking with somebody one-on-one. So that was responding to misinformation when you see it. Another thing you can do to combat misinformation is be proactive. Next slide, please. All right, and you can do that by engaging, like, comment, share, save, throw up in your stories. Interacting with science-based content will make it more likely to get seen by other people. If you're comfortable, you can also put out your own science-based information on your own timeline, and you can be a consistent source of accurate info for your friends and family. When I talk about debunking, I'll talk about knowing who your audience trusts, and that's really key here. Is that sometimes you are the person that you're the most trusted person in your network. So throwing stuff up on your own timeline can be helpful. Just making sure you're getting that science-based content out there, dialing up the volume of science-based content, and diminishing the power, lowering the volume of misinformation on social media. If you expect misinformation on a given topic, but that misinformation hasn't started circulating yet, one thing you can do is pre-bunk or inoculate people against that misinformation. This is a really cool idea that it works a lot like vaccination, letting people know, hey, heads up, this is a technique that could be used, or this is something that some people might try to get you to believe. Don't believe it because of X, Y, and Z. It can actually help, just like vaccines help prompt the immune system, having those pre-bunking or inoculating posts can help prompt people to be on their guard and to protect themselves against believing misinformation. And so a really quick example of that is actually in the debunking handbook, which is an amazing resource. I'll throw up a link in the end. But the debunking handbook has the example of reminding people that back in the 1960s, the tobacco industry paid fake experts to kick up dust and muddy the waters to make it seem like harms of smoking was being overplayed. When you remind people of that, they actually are more likely to be skeptical when they see fake experts in other areas, or experts being used for other purposes. But if the misinformation is already out there, it's gaining traction, people are believing it, it could seriously cause harm, then something you want to do is debunk. So this is a helpful formula. Again, it's in the debunking handbook. It's also in the vaccine misinformation management field guide, which is another absolutely amazing resource that we'll mention at the end. They draw a lot on psychology and research and communication to craft debunking messages. So you want to start strong with your own talking point. Don't start with the misinformation or the anti-vaccine act talking point. Start with your own. Make it just as sticky as those sticky misinforming headlines, right? Then once you get the sticky fact at the top, you want to go ahead and warn about the myth. Now, a lot of people in public health have been worried about debunking because they were worried about the backfire effect, which is the effect where people, the simple act of repeating the myth, even if it's in debunking, will get people to believe it because we remember what we've seen more often, right? Recent research, though, shows that the backfire effect, when it comes in the context of debunking, actually isn't very strong. And actually, the risk of letting this misinformation go unchallenged is greater than the risk of this backfire effect when you repeat the myth. So go ahead and state the myth or the misinformation that you're trying to debunk. Maybe just stick to only repeating it once, though. But don't be afraid to talk about the myth just because you're worried about that backfire effect. Then explain why the false claim is not true. And this is where it's really important to get detailed. Don't be afraid to dive into this was the technique that was used. If you follow that logic, this is also something that could be true. And really dive into why it's wrong, why people might have believed it before, but how we know it's not true now. This is also really important. If the misinformation was answering a question, replace the answer to that question. Because if you say, this is the reason, if the misinformation was saying, this is the reason why X happened, and then you take away that explanation, it leaves a vacuum, and that can make it really uncomfortable for people. So replace that. Instead of saying that's not true, say that's not true, but this is, or this also explains what might have happened. And then again, end with the fact, end sticky. You want to end strong with something that people that people will remember. This is an example from the Vaccine Misinformation Management Field Guide. This particular one is about HPV vaccines, but they have other examples too, and I highly recommend checking out that field guide because they have some really great details about some of the strategies that I've been talking about. All right, so I really like that framework. I think it can be a helpful way to organize thoughts. Some things to keep in mind though, pick your battles. Not every piece of misinfo needs debunking. If it's a fringe conspiracy theory that doesn't really hurt anybody, don't waste your time and energy crafting a debunking message. If you see it, report it, but otherwise maybe focus your energy on something that's gained traction or that could really harm people. You also want to keep your audience in mind. So when you're writing any kind of message, but especially debunking messages, who do you want to read it and walk away with a more accurate belief? What kinds of words resonate and could be easily understood with that group? What matters to them? So for example, I work with many Latinx communities where family is paramount, very important in many cultures. And so when I craft messages or share anecdotes, I try to keep that in mind, that value in mind. You also want to consider who might be the best messenger or source for the debunking information. Messages are only as good as the messenger. So think about who the people you're talking to, who they trust. It might not be the CDC. It might not be scientists. It might not be doctors. As Jennifer mentioned, there have been some awful things that have been done in the name of science and that are still happening in medicine today. And so we want to keep that in mind and maybe look to, who does that community trust? And it might not be you. And so if it's not, go ahead and try and find there might be somebody who would be trusted in that community who's already debunked the misinformation, and you can amplify their content instead of creating your own. And then again, along those lines, take steps to be trustworthy yourself. I know we're running out of time and I'm sorry, I'm trying to talk quickly, but I get really excited about this content. So try to be trustworthy yourself, make sure that the content you put out is true, it is accurate, because you're only as good as your word. So then the last thing I want to talk about is storytelling. There are two strategies that you can use to combat misinformation, really about this low hum of misinformation that is trying to tell people that vaccine preventable diseases are not harmful and that vaccination is scary, right? So next slide, please. So an example of that is sharing stories of vaccine preventable diseases or people who have been affected by vaccine preventable diseases. Families Fighting Flu has some really great content. Vaccinate Your Family on our website. We have a whole section of stories that you can share, videos, as well as text. And then also post positive experiences with vaccination. If you got the COVID shot, go ahead and share it, because if the only thing that people hear about when they read news articles or see posts about vaccines is negative stuff, then that's what they're going to associate. They're going to have those negative associations with vaccines. So go ahead and post up some happy, smiling babies with Band-Aids on their legs, your COVID, your flu shot selfie. Go ahead and put that positive vaccine information out there so that those positive associations can start resonating. Next slide. All right, and then just self-care, please be prepared for pushback. Use that mute, block, hide, banning people if necessary. If you are getting into a back and forth and it's really stressing you out, mute notifications on that post. You don't have to go back. You owe nobody anything. You can go ahead and post this isn't true, here's a link, and then turn off notifications for that post. Protect yourself, protect your mental health. And then for more information, there are some really great websites that have debunked things already, or that have answers to questions that people have. Here are a bunch. Our website has some great ones. As I mentioned, the Misinformation Guide has some great content. Next slide. And then some more credible resources for information. I'm going to go ahead and throw up in the chat the links to the debunking handbook and the vaccine misinformation management hand guide. And with that, I think we're ready for questions. I know we only have a minute or so. Thank you all so much. I apologize for talking so quickly.
Thank you so much, Robin and Jennifer. That was an excellent presentation. We are at time, but we'll go ahead, and if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will definitely answer them and send them out along with links to this recording and to a PDF of these slides. So real quick, I'll just pick a question. How do you recommend navigating the, quote, freedom of speech argument when flagging misinformation or educating your peers? If Robin or Catherine or Jennifer have any a quick response to that question.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Go
yeah.
ahead, Robin.
A little to that. So the freedom of speech, the First Amendment really only applies to the government censoring individuals. So if a private company like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, I guess it's owned by Facebook, but if a private company wants to decide, what they put on their content, that is up to them to do. You are free to continue to share whatever speech you want to share. You just don't have, you have a right to share that speech. You just don't have a right to use whatever platform you want to use to do it, especially if it's a privately owned company.
All right, thanks. Well, so we are at time. Please complete the survey. We are super interested in bringing you relevant content. This forum is a series, so we will be touching on combating vaccine misinformation in communities of color next. So please fill out the survey, subscribe to our newsletter, especially if you want information about the next webinar. We don't have time for Q&A, so I think we got overly ambitious. There's just a lot here, and I'm so glad that Robin, Jennifer, and Catherine were able to come on and share so much great information. We, the HPV Roundtable, are also online, so if you're looking for good, accurate, evidence-based content to interact with, please follow us. We're on Facebook, Twitter, we are on Instagram now, and YouTube. And you can get in touch with me and my esteemed colleague, Jennifer Konga. You can only work in this area if your name is Jennifer. I'm sorry, Robin and Catherine, but contact a Jen near you and we'll be happy to get in touch with answers. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been a really great hour, and we look forward to bringing you more content on a future webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.